The security scanner flashed red. Access denied. I tried again, pressed my thumb flat against the pad the way I had done 100 times before. Same result. I stepped back and looked at the gate. My gate. My name was printed on the hard hat hanging inside that office. My signature was on the original land deed for this site. The two security guards near the entrance shifted their weight. They didn't say anything. They just watched me the way people watch someone who doesn't belong somewhere, careful, quiet, waiting. I was about to call the site manager when I heard footsteps behind me. Adrian walked in through the side entrance like he owned the place. Shoulders relaxed, face calm. He was wearing a pressed white shirt and carrying a leather folder I had given him for his birthday 3 years ago. He looked at me the way you look at an old piece of furniture you've already decided to throw out. "You shouldn't be here," he said. My chest tightened the way it does just before something breaks. The anger hit me first. Then the confusion came right behind it, faster and colder. He tilted his head slightly like he was waiting for me to argue. "You signed it over," he said. "If you're thrilled and you don't want to miss out on this roller coaster, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment now. Let's dive into the story. My name is Daniel Cross. I built Cross Urban Development from nothing. Not from a family loan, not from a business partner's money, from nothing. I was 26 years old, working nights at a print shop and spending every free hour studying land contracts and construction permits. I wrote my first business proposal on a kitchen table I bought secondhand for $12. Every contract this company signed, I negotiated. Every blueprint on file, I reviewed. Every client relationship was built by me personally, with phone calls and handshakes and late evenings after everyone else had gone home. I wasn't just the owner of Cross Urban Development. I was its foundation. The reason it stood and kept standing. 22 years of choices, sacrifices, early mornings, and sleepless nights poured into one company. And yet, on a Thursday morning in March, I was standing outside my own project like a man who had wandered onto someone else's land. The guards were still watching me. Adrian had already walked past them without stopping. His access badge had worked just fine. I stood there in the cold for a moment, because here is the thing that kept circling in my mind, the thing that made no sense no matter how many times I turned it over. I never signed anything. Let me take you back to the beginning, because nothing that happened makes sense without it. I grew up without much. My father left when I was 8. My mother worked 2 jobs and still came up short most months. I learned early that no one was going to hand me anything. That lesson settled into my bones young, and it never left. By the time I was in my early 30s, I had a small but growing development company and a reputation for finishing what I started. I worked long days. I showed up on site before the machines did. I knew the name of every foreman, every inspector, every delivery driver who came through regularly. People saw that. They talked about it. The company grew because of it. My employees didn't just work for me. Most of them stayed for years because they trusted me. Clients came back because I kept my word. The company became something I was proud of. And then I met Claire. She was smart and steady, and she made me feel like the work I had been doing all those years was building towards something more than just contracts and profit. I thought I was finally putting the right pieces together. That included her son. Adrian was 19 years old the first time I shook his hand. He was quiet back then, not unfriendly, just careful. He watched things more than he talked. At dinner, he asked questions about the business, not the exciting parts but the structural parts. How zoning decisions worked, how contracts were written, how authority moved through a company like mine. I liked that about him. I thought it showed maturity. I gave him things I never had growing up. I paid for the rest of his college degree. When he graduated, I brought him into Cross Urban with a real position, not a courtesy title. I introduced him to clients as someone worth knowing. I trusted him with meetings, then with accounts, then with decisions that shaped how projects moved forward. I told myself I was giving him a future, and I believed it completely. I never felt like he was taking anything. Because when someone is patient and always has a reasonable explanation for why they need just a little more access, you don't see the shape of what they're doing. You just see a young man learning the business. Looking back now, I understand something I missed completely. He never once asked for power. He studied it. I pulled out my phone and called the IT department from the parking lot of my own job site. The phone rang 4 times before someone picked up. I recognized the voice, a young technician named Paul who had worked with the company for about 2 years. He was steady and good at his job. I had always trusted him. "Paul," I said, "this is Daniel Cross. I'm standing outside Riverside and my access credentials aren't working. I need you to reset them now." A pause, not short. The kind that means the person on the other end is carefully deciding something. "Mr. Cross," Paul said slowly, "I'll need to look into that first." "Look into what?" "My credentials stopped working. Fix it." More typing. Then nothing. Not the silence of someone who doesn't have the answer. The silence of someone who does and isn't sure they should be the one delivering it. "Sir," Paul said quietly, "your admin privileges were reassigned." Something cold moved through me. "Reassigned," I repeated. "By who?" The typing stopped completely. A long silence. Then Paul spoke again, his voice low, like he was making sure nobody nearby could hear him. "One name, Adrian." I drove back to the main office and went straight to records. The woman at the front desk, a calm professional named Donna who had worked there for 8 years, looked at me with something I had never seen on her face before, hesitation. "I need the authorization files for the Riverside project," I told her. "Everything going back 12 months. She made a phone call first. I watched her do it. She turned slightly away, spoke quietly, then turned back. "I'll need to request those," she said. "You report to me," I said. "Request approved." It took an hour. I spent it sitting outside my own records room in a building with my name on the lease, drinking bad coffee from the hallway machine. When the files finally came, I found it immediately. An authorization document. A formal structural control transfer for the Riverside project. My digital signature sat clean and official above a date stamp. 6 months ago. I sat very still and looked at that date. 6 months ago, I was in Portugal for a conference. I had hotel receipts, flight records, photos on my phone. I had dinner with a city planner from Lisbon on the exact evening that document was supposedly signed. I was not in this country that day. I waited until after dinner to confront Claire. I had spent the drive home thinking about how to say it, whether to come in calm or direct, whether to ask questions or state facts. In the end, I just put the printed authorization document on the kitchen counter between us and watched her face. She looked down at it. She looked up at me. She didn't look confused. She didn't look defensive. She didn't look like a woman who had just seen something shocking. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for this conversation. "It's just restructuring," she said. Her voice was level, calm, almost bored. "Restructuring," I repeated. The company needed clearer authority at the project level. Adrian has been managing Riverside for months. This just made it official. I stared at her. "My signature is on that document. I was in Europe when it was signed." "There must be a timing error," she said. She picked up her wine glass. "I'm sure Adrian can explain it." And that was when I understood. She wasn't scrambling for an answer. She wasn't panicking. She was deflecting with the relaxed ease of someone who had already rehearsed this moment. Claire already knew, not just about Riverside, about all of it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my home office until 3 in the morning going back through emails, 6 months, then 12, then further. I read things I had skimmed at the time and dismissed as routine. Meetings I had apparently agreed to miss. Decisions made on my behalf while I was busy on other sites. Emails I was CC'd on but never replied to because someone had already replied using my name. The pattern was not obvious. That was the point. It hadn't happened all at once. There was no single moment when everything shifted. It was gradual, surgical. One small transfer of authority, then another. One document reworded slightly. One meeting where I wasn't present but my position was represented by someone else. Nothing that would trigger alarm by itself. Some people don't take control by force. They replace it piece by piece, so slowly that by the time you notice the weight of something missing, it's been gone for a long time. I kept reading. The further back I went, the more I found. Little changes, small redirections, authority quietly moving sideways, always toward Adrian, always with a clean paper trail that pointed just barely, just enough toward my approval. And I had signed more than I remembered. My financial advisor called me at 8:47 the next morning. His name was Warren. He had managed my personal accounts for 11 years. He was not an emotional man. He dealt in numbers and facts and rarely called unless something was wrong. The fact that he called before 9 told me everything before he spoke a word. "Daniel," he said, "I've been looking at the cross-urban ownership records since you asked me to review them last week. I need to talk to you about something." "Go ahead." "Your ownership percentage," he paused. "It's been diluted." My hand tightened on the phone. "How much?" Another pause. Warren was not a man who paused often. "You're no longer the majority owner," he said. The room went quiet around me. Not literally, I could hear traffic outside, the hum of the air conditioner. But something in my thinking went very still, the way it does when you finally hear out loud what you already suspected. I asked him when it happened. He said it had been gradual, over 18 months. Small dilutions each time spread across different filings structured to stay under the threshold that would trigger a mandatory notification. I asked who held the majority now. He told me. Adrian. There was one man I knew I could trust. Victor Hale had been my project manager for 14 years. He was with me since the early days, back when we ran two-man crews on small residential jobs. He knew this company the way a person knows their own house, not just the rooms but the walls, the pipes, the things hidden behind surfaces. I met him at a diner 4 blocks from the office, away from everything that now had eyes I didn't fully trust. He was already in the booth when I arrived. His coffee was half gone. He looked tired in the way people look when they've been carrying something heavy and finally see someone they can set it down with. "I tried to warn you," he said. Not surprising. Not disbelief. "I tried to warn you." I sat down. "When?" 8 months ago. "I sent you an email about access changes on the Riverside files. You replied saying you had authorized them." I had never sent that reply. We both knew it now. Victor looked at his coffee cup. "I told myself you knew what you were doing, but something never sat right." He had stayed, he had watched, he had waited, and he had kept copies. Victor opened his laptop right there at the diner table. He had been careful. That was the first thing I noticed. He hadn't kept the files on any company server, any company device. He had transferred everything to a personal hard drive months ago, quietly, without telling anyone. He pulled up the documents one by one. First, there were original contract drafts, versions from before the edits. The same contracts I thought I had reviewed but with different language, clauses that protected my ownership clearly. Language that had been softened, then replaced, then removed entirely in the final versions that carried my signature. Then there were the emails, messages that had been redirected, conversations between Adrian and legal contacts that never appeared in my inbox, even though my name was sometimes mentioned inside them. Then the approval chains. Long internal threads where decisions were formally attributed to me, my name, my title, my authority, without any actual communication to me at all. I looked at my own signature on document after document. The spacing was identical every time. The exact same version of my digital sign-off, copied and placed precisely over and over across months of paperwork. My signature wasn't being faked from scratch. It was being reused. I sat with the evidence for a full day before I let myself think about the deeper structure of what had been done. Adrian hadn't broken into anything. That was the thing that kept coming back to me. He hadn't hacked the system. He hadn't bribed anyone in it. He hadn't forged documents in the way people imagine forgery from the outside, against resistance. He had used internal systems, tools and permissions I had given him freely over years, because I trusted him and because I believed I was preparing him for a future in the company I built. He had watched how authority moved inside cross-urban development. He understood the approval chains better than most of my long-term employees because I had let him sit in on every meeting that mattered. He knew which documents carried weight. He knew which signatures unlocked which doors. He didn't break in. He was invited. He walked through every door I had ever opened for him, and he quietly changed the locks behind him. And when I looked back further past Adrian into the timeline of small suggestions and gentle conversations about efficiency, conversations I now remembered very differently, I realized he hadn't done this alone. Claire had access too, Not just to the company, to me. Memory is strange when you look at it through new eyes. I thought back to specific moments that had seemed small at the time, ordinary, even thoughtful. Adrian asked me about 3 years ago detailed questions about how shareholder authority worked in a closely held company. I was pleased by the question. I thought it showed business maturity. I answered him fully. Claire suggested about 2 years ago that we bring in a legal consultant to modernize several older contracts. I remembered thinking it was a smart idea. The consultant she recommended, a quiet, efficient woman named Helen, had spent 3 weeks working through our documents. I was busy with 2 active projects at the time. I trusted the process. Helen, I now understood, had been the person who introduced the language change that buried my protection clause. And then, 18 months ago, Claire gently suggested that Adrian needed real ownership stakes to stay motivated. I remembered feeling proud that she cared about his future. I remembered agreeing to let Warren restructure a small portion of my ownership into shares for Adrian. Small. Just a start, she had said. Every one of these moments had felt separate, unconnected. Every single one of them was preparation. This had started years ago. Victor found the original operating agreement. Not the current version. The original, the one I had drafted personally with my attorney Frank Doyle in the company's early years, before Cross Urban was large enough to attract the kind of attention it would eventually carry. I read through every page, looking carefully for the clause I remembered insisting on, the one Frank had called overprotective at the time. It stated clearly that operational and ownership control could only transfer if the founding member provided written consent, witnessed by 2 independent parties and verified by a licensed notary. That clause was completely gone. In its place sat one sentence I had to read 3 times slowly. Adaptive control authority may be redistributed based on operational efficiency determinations made by senior internal stakeholders. Legal. Clean. Devastating. At the bottom of the final version was my signature on the approval line. The version I had apparently signed after the so-called modernization. The version I had never actually read carefully because Claire had handed it to me during a very busy week and told me it was just routine paperwork. I thought I knew what I had approved. I had approved my own removal. Something shifted in me that afternoon, not like a sudden change, more like weather clearing. The anger that had been sitting behind my eyes since the moment I was turned away at that gate, it didn't disappear, but it moved. It settled into something quieter and more useful. I had spent 3 days reacting, feeling it, processing it, turning it over and looking at each piece and feeling the heat of what had been done. I was finished with that part. They had counted on the confusion slowing me down. They had built the whole thing on layers of complexity, assuming that when I finally discovered what had happened, the sheer size of it would scatter my thinking. It didn't. It focused me. I knew exactly what I had. I knew exactly what they had. I knew the timeline. I knew the methods. I knew the documents Victor had saved, and I knew what they proved. I also knew something else, something they had either forgotten or never known in the first place. There was one piece of the original structure of this company that no one had ever touched. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't know it was there. I stopped reacting. I started planning. Let me tell you about the compliance clause. Years ago, when Cross Urban was first getting large enough to take on government-adjacent construction projects, I had a long conversation with Frank Doyle about regulatory risk. Frank told me that the biggest threat to a growing company wasn't competition. It was being caught unprepared by an audit. We built a specific clause into the company's foundational regulatory filing. Not into the operating agreement, those could be changed relatively easily. Into the regulatory filing itself, which sits with the county and requires a formal external review process to alter. The clause stated that any major contractual commitment on a government-adjacent project had to be verified against a specific compliance checklist before it could be finalized. The checklist had to be cleared by the company's founding director, a position held permanently by me, regardless of any internal restructuring. It was a safeguard, a quiet one. The kind that sits in old paperwork and never comes up until the exact moment it needs to. Adrian's team had gone through the operating agreement, the ownership records, the approval chains. They had worked through everything visible. They never found this clause, because they didn't know to look for it, and they forgot it existed. I needed someone I had never used before. Not Frank Doyle. Adrian knew Frank's name, knew he was connected to me. I needed someone with no prior relationship to Cross Urban at all. A colleague of Warren's referred me to a legal consultant named Patricia Osai. She worked primarily in commercial fraud and regulatory compliance. I called her on a Wednesday evening and gave her nothing over the phone except the basics. We met the following morning in her office, which was neat and functional and had no personal photos anywhere on the walls. I put everything on her desk: the original contract drafts, Victor's backup files, the redirected emails, the approval chains with my name on decisions I never made, Warren's ownership timeline, the digital signature duplication patterns, the dated discrepancies. Patricia looked through each document in order. She didn't react the way most people would. She didn't shake her head or exhale sharply or look up at me with wide eyes. She just read. When she finished, she stacked everything neatly and sat back in her chair and looked at me steadily. "Mr. Cross," she said, "what you have here goes well beyond an internal dispute." She picked up her pen. "This is bigger than internal fraud." 3 days after my meeting with Patricia, Adrian made a public announcement. He called a company-wide meeting, which he apparently now had the authority to do, and formally presented himself as the operational lead of Cross Urban Development. He thanked the team for their support during the transition period. He spoke about the future of the company with the calm confidence of someone who had already closed every door behind them. I was not in the room. That was by design. Not his design, mine. I had decided after speaking with Patricia that the most dangerous thing I could do right now was show my hand. Every confrontation, every challenge, every angry phone call gave them information. It told them where I was in my thinking. It gave Adrian time to prepare, so I stayed quiet. I did not attend. I did not respond to the meeting invitation. I did not send a message through anyone. From where Adrian was standing, it probably looked like I was done. Like the shock and the complexity had done exactly what they were supposed to do. He stepped to the front of that room and announced full control over the company I had built. He was confident. He was polished. He believed I had stepped away. Victor called me the following Tuesday. He had been doing something I had asked him to do quietly, going through the server logs from the past 18 months. Not the documents themselves, but the metadata behind them, the timestamps, the access records, the system activity logs that most people never think to look at because they seem like background noise. What he found was a pattern. My digital signature had been applied to documents at times when, according to the server logs, my personal login credentials were inactive. Not just on the day I was in Portugal, multiple times across the past year and a half. There were sessions where my credentials were used, but the typing patterns, the speed, the navigation path, the specific sequence of actions didn't match anything in my prior usage history. The system was smart enough to log those differences, even if no one had ever been instructed to look at them. Victor printed everything and brought it to me in person. We sat in my truck in a parking garage because I trusted it more than any room in the office building right now. I looked at the logs. The time-stamped inconsistencies were clear, unmistakable. This was proof, hard, technical, traceable proof. It could not have been me. Patricia and I spoke every other day during that period. She had been building the formal legal case steadily, quietly, without making any contact with Cross Urban's internal systems or personnel. Everything was coming together. The evidence was strong. The regulatory angle built around the compliance clause in the foundational filing was airtight. But Patricia told me something important. She said the most powerful moment in a case like this was not the confrontation. It was the trap. Let him use the authority he thinks he has, she said. Let him make a major decision under that authority, something large enough to trigger your compliance clause automatically. I knew exactly what she meant. Adrian had been in extended negotiations with a large property developer named Keswick Partners for a joint project on a decommissioned industrial site. It was the biggest deal Cross Urban had ever attempted, government-adjacent, publicly significant. Exactly the kind of deal that triggered the compliance checklist. Exactly the kind of deal that required the founding director's sign-off. I said nothing. I made no calls. I sent no warnings. I let Adrian finalize the Keswick deal under his authority, the deal he had no legal power to close. I was sitting at home when it happened. Patricia had explained what would occur once the Keswick deal was formally filed with the county. The compliance clause was embedded in the regulatory framework. It wasn't optional. It wasn't something Adrian's team could override or delay. The moment that filing landed, the system I had designed years ago began doing exactly what it was built to do. Regulatory auditors contacted Cross Urban Development on a Friday morning, not because anyone called them, because the automated compliance review process had flagged the Keswick filing. Adrian apparently called Patricia immediately, which told me he had already been told I was working with her. He was calm on the phone, she said, professional. He explained that the ownership structure had been updated and that he had full authority over project decisions. Patricia had told him to provide founding director authorization to proceed. He couldn't, because I was the founding director and I had authorized nothing. I heard later from Victor that Claire had called him twice that Friday. Her voice, he said, was different from anything he had heard from her before. Not calm, not controlled, panicked. For the first time in this entire process, something had gone wrong that she couldn't redirect or explain away. They needed my authorization to proceed. They came to me on a Saturday morning, not to the house. Adrian called first, then Claire separately. They asked to meet at the office. I chose a conference room at a nearby hotel instead, somewhere neutral, somewhere quiet, somewhere with no history between us. I arrived first. I sat with my coffee and my folder and waited. When they walked in, the dynamic was completely different. Adrian held his folder tightly. He sat across from me and began speaking immediately, the regulatory issue, the timeline, what needed to happen to save the Keswick deal. His words were measured and careful, but underneath them something was gone. The quiet authority he had worn comfortably for months had cracked. Claire sat beside him and said very little. I listened without interrupting. When Adrian finished, I let the silence sit. They had not come as a family. They had not come as partners. They had come as people in real trouble who needed my signature to stay out of a much larger problem. I looked at them both. They had spent 18 months believing they had taken everything that mattered. In that room, they finally began to understand. I still held the one thing they could never replace. I met with Patricia the following Monday morning. Everything was prepared. Every document is organized. Every timestamp is independently verified. Every discrepancy tied directly to a specific, provable fact with no gaps anywhere in the chain. We presented the full case to the County Regulatory Board in a formal session. The evidence: original contract drafts showing the removed ownership clause. Victor's server logs proving my digital signature had been applied during sessions when my credentials were technically inactive. Warren's timeline shows ownership dilution, structured carefully to stay under mandatory notification thresholds. Redirected email chains that had never once reached my actual inbox. Formal approval records carrying my name and title for decisions I had never made or been consulted on. The compliance clause sat at the center of everything. The one piece no one had ever found or altered. The one piece that made every other piece legally actionable. The Keswick deal was frozen immediately, pending full investigation. The ownership transfer records were formally challenged. Adrian's authority, every document, every title, every position was suspended pending review. Several board members who had been quietly uncomfortable for months finally had the standing to act. They turned to face him in that room. Nobody spoke. Adrian's authority collapsed completely. Claire tried to speak to me privately after the hearing. She called it a misunderstanding. She said things had moved faster than she intended. She said Adrian had pushed harder than she realized. She said it was never supposed to go this far. I listened to all of it. I didn't respond with anger. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tell her what I thought of 18 months of careful, deliberate work designed to take everything I had built. Everything that needed saying had already been submitted to the regulatory board in an organized folder. Adrian said nothing during the follow-up proceedings. For the first time since I had known him, he had no prepared answer, no steady composure. He sat in that room and looked like someone who had walked very carefully into a space and only then noticed the walls closing in. The system he had used, every permission I gave him, every access point he worked into, every document trail he built, was now running backward through every stage, exposing it precisely, the way he had constructed it. He lost every piece of authority he had spent years quietly taking, and I never once raised my voice. I regained full legal control of cross-urban development 11 weeks later, not just on paper, completely. Every project, every account, every system. My founding director status was confirmed in the regulatory record. The ownership dilution was reversed. The Keswick deal was renegotiated under my name and closed 4 months later at better terms. Victor went back to managing projects. Warren went back to managing accounts. I did not go back to who I was. I restructured, quietly, permanently. Every access privilege now has an expiration date and a review process. Every authorization requires 2 independent confirmations. Every major document goes to Frank Doyle before going anywhere else. The compliance clause has 3 additional layers now, embedded in separate filings that cannot all be reached at once. I think about what they studied. They studied the company. They studied the systems. They learned how authority moved and where the gaps were. They were patient. They were thorough. But they studied the company I used to run. They never studied what I would become once I understood what they had done. They never studied what a man looks like when he built something from nothing, watched it get taken piece by piece, and then took it all back with nothing but time, documents, and patience. Now they know.